All righty, welcome. I am Heather Pierce Campbell, the legal website warrior. I'm an attorney and legal coach based here in Seattle, Washington, serving online information entrepreneurs throughout the US and the world. Welcome to another episode of Guts, Grit, and Great Business. I am so excited to bring you a very special guest today, my friend David Gruder. Welcome, David.
Oh, thank you so much. I've been looking forward to us enjoying each other during this podcast.
Oh my gosh. Well, I feel like for one, this is way overdue. For those of you that don't know David, I met David, gosh, years ago now. I want to say, was it like 2017? The first time? Because it was a JVology in Calgary.
Yeah, it could have been 2017 or 2018.
2018. Yep, somewhere in there. And then, I think again at the JVology event in San Diego right before COVID hit.
Right?
But what you guys don't know is that I felt an immediate connection to David. I just loved his message and his work right away. And I mean, of course, like anybody over the last handful of years, that work has evolved. And I am super excited for you to hear David's message today and to help share it because the timing, the timing is just so right. There's a lot of really poignant things happening in the world. And I feel like so many people are going to benefit from hearing from David today. So for those of you that don't know David, Dr. David Gruder is a multi-award winning Wall Street Journal best-selling psychologist who radio TV interview report named America's integrity expert. I love that so much. And I'll mention something on that point. And how he has been hailed as having a field of wisdom that few can match. And I can tell you personally the truth of that. A business life cycle psychology and pioneer in psycho-spiritual fitness for leaders and executives with a deep commitment to ethical leadership, Dr. Gruder is a beacon of inspiration for those seeking to revolutionize their organizations, enlighten their communities, and create lasting positive impact in the world. He has helped countless individuals and organizations around the world chart a path toward a more ethical, values-driven, and universally prosperous society. Dr. Gruder excels at turning high intentions into practical step-by-step procedures. He blends psycho-spiritual mysteries of the soul with boots-on-the-ground skills that equip leaders in business, society, and governance to flourish. The most recent of his many books are The Nimble C-Suite and The Nimble Company. David, I love you and I love your message so much. And I think one of the things that really resonated for me when I first met you is this theme around integrity and ethics. And what a lot of people don't know is one of the things that actually got me into law was writing a paper on legal ethics.
Ooh,
Mhm.
marvelous.
Yeah, it was fabulous. And even in my early years in law, I ended up teaching numerous CLEs on the topic of legal ethics and what
Mm,
they tell us. And actually, not only legal ethics, but lawyer jokes and what they tell us about the legal profession.
right.
So, yep, it's been a long-standing theme. Anyways, I love other people who are in the field of ethics, integrity, and really I think the other aspect to you that's really powerful is how practical you are about how to bring this alive for people and make it something that they can implement and do right now.
Thank you. That's really where my passion is,
Mhm.
translating good intentions into effective actions.
Right. Well, and I think, the struggle is real for a lot of people in positions of leadership or influence about having good intentions, but not knowing how to translate that into something that has the impact they want to have.
So true. So true. And I'll add as a parenthetical comment that I'm the gratefully recovering son of an attorney, which you know. My father was an impeccable attorney ethics wise. And
Mm.
I really got a deep-seated sense of ethics, including legal ethics and constitutional ethics from my father growing up, which makes me a particularly odd duck as a psychologist.
Right? Not everybody is right, has a legal mind in their family, and especially one that shares openly. Some people have attorneys in their family, but they are kind of, self-encapsulated in their work. They don't bring a lot of it home or talk about it a lot with kids and family, depending on the area of work. But that is fascinating. And the maybe two other people in my life that I know that come from a family like that where they had a legal mind who shared a lot, I actually have tremendous respect for. They ended up not in law, which, is always interesting, but are really, really interesting decision makers.
Mhm, mhm. My father, to his credit, did not tell me that he thought that I would have made a really effective trial lawyer until after I was enrolled in my doctoral program in psychology.
Interesting. Good job, Dad.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Good for him. Well, I would be curious because, I always love the origin story, and I know you have one even around childhood. I mean, we were joking just before we went live. I think you said the phrase, "It's never too late to have a happy childhood." And I thought, wow, that's a powerful message that people need to hear. And I think that, there were some challenges in your childhood. Do you mind sharing a little bit about your story?
Oh, no, I mean, we could spend the entire time on that, which we'll not do, um, because there are so many juicy stories from my childhood. But
Mm,
I'll tell you a couple that are particularly important to me. One was that in elementary school, I had this, the equivalent of an X on my forehead saying to my peers, "If you're looking for someone to bully, I'm your person." And that came from, an experience that I had when I was about, 5 years old, 6 years old, when a boy who had been bullying me, uh, I reached what I call the Popeye point from the Popeye
mm,
cartoons, where just before he reaches for his spinach, he says, "That's all I can stands. I can't stands no more." I call that the Popeye point. And I reached the Popeye point with this boy, and uh, I was a really peaceful, happy kid. I was not a violent kid, but I landed a left hook onto his face and decked him. And he was
mm,
just crying on the ground. And what happened for me was I scared the hell out of myself. I
mm,
realized at that young age that I had killer energy in me, and I had no idea what to do with that energy. So I completely pushed it away and divorced it. And instead of potentially becoming a perpetrator, I became a victim. And so
mm,
I really grew up understanding what being bullied felt like, and what being on the receiving end of being a target felt like, because I was, even up through eighth grade, I was regularly ambushed and beaten up going home from school for being Jewish.
mm,
So while they were hurling demeaning comments about Jews verbally, I was being beaten up by a group of boys physically. And all of that could have turned me into a victim or could have turned me into a hater.
mhm,
What it did was it turned me into a lover.
mm,
And on the other hand, I, by the time I was 16 years old, I was saying out loud in words, "I don't do anger." because the only
Mm.
version of anger that I saw growing up in my family was rageaholism and cabinet door slamming. So passive aggressive, covert anger, and very explosive verbal anger.
Mhm.
And because those were the only two versions of anger that I grew up with in my own family, and at 16, I didn't know that anger came in any other flavor than those flavors. I was saying, I don't do anger. It wasn't until I was in my 40s that I finally started developing a healthy relationship with anger.
Mm. Oh,
So,
so many bells going off for me because I feel like, I mean, a couple of things stand out. One about the choice you made as a child, right? Seeing that rage come kind of full frontal center in your own existence and being. And it sounds like making a meaningful choice around, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to be that, which took you the other direction. Obviously, now you see it in the lens of love and that experience. It sounds like really helping you to become, this wealth of wisdom that you are.
mm,
The topic of anger, I feel like, is so relevant. It's so relevant. And I think so many of us learn the wrong lessons about anger at a young age, right? Because whether it's generational, whatever it is, the messaging, I think, for so many of us, and I can speak that in my family, my dad grew up in a household where his father, and I love my grandfather, and he had human struggles like so many of us do. He was fairly abusive. He had 11 children, and so often to get little boys in line and keep this horde of kids in line, he was physical with them, and he was particularly physical with my dad. And so my dad, to his credit, took the reverse role in his parenting. Like, I'm not going to do anger. I'm not going to raise my voice. I'm not going to raise a hand. And he didn't, to his credit. And still, the lesson that we learned about anger was that it's not okay. You shove it down, you shove it to the side, you don't talk about it, you don't address it, you put it under the rug. And I think so many of us, like you in our adult lives, it's the first time that we really learn to not necessarily befriend anger, but to like address it, to face it, to dissect it, to start to have the conversation around, what is this thing called anger? How do we deal with it in a more healthy way?
yeah, absolutely. We could actually spend the entire episode talking about this.
Right. It's a big
And
topic. It's
it's
a
a big
big
topic. And
topic.
what most people don't know, and I certainly didn't know until I finally started reconnecting with and addressing my anger in my, like I said, in my 40s, uh, is that anger comes in four distinctly different flavors. And the only version of anger that's true, pure anger isn't even called anger,
Mm,
because what pure anger is really a half of a boundary. Pure anger, pure anger is no and ouch.
yeah. Yeah.
But
It's the
that doesn't get,
flag, right? It's the red
yeah,
flag that pops up.
yeah. And of course, that's half of a boundary, because the other half of a boundary is yes and yum, in contrast to no and ouch. Um, and the things that get called anger are all of the dysfunctional expressions of anger.
That are being masked by
So
this
when you
thing we called anger.
exactly, and so when you said the phrase befriend anger and then you almost took it back,
Right.
I'm going to take it all the way. Yes, it is crucial to befriend real anger. It's
Yeah.
crucial to befriend the only thing that's pure anger that's not called anger, which is no and ouch. Because if we don't have our boundaries, if we don't know what fits for us and what doesn't fit for us, we cannot flourish in the world.
No, no, we can't. No, we can't. And I think so often what happens is anger can so easily mask sadness, it can mask fear, it can mask these other things. We call it anger, but there's really something deeper. But you're right, like true anger is about boundaries.
Yes. Right. Well, we had talked before we started recording about what I could offer your guests, and I didn't even think
Yes.
about this, or your guests, your viewers. So one of the things that I'll make available is a primer on the four flavors of anger and how each of them needs to be dealt with differently from the others.
Oh, I love that so much. I mean, it's something that I still have more work to do on personally. So perfect. If you're listening, pop over because this will be one, I'm sure, of many links that we're going to share. Not only in, how you can get in touch with David and learn more, but on this particular resource, which is a primer on anger. Thank you, David. That sounds amazing.
Cool.
Um, so so you had these experiences in childhood. You began to deal with, really processing anger in your 40s. Is there more like this experience of, turning that childhood? Sounds like not just one experience, a long list of experiences along a same theme. At what age were you when you decided those made you love?
Mm. I It started to shift for me when I was in my late teens and early 20s.
Mm,
I Up until probably my final year of high school, and even then, I had taken on the mantle of being the innocent victim, the one that harmful things happened to, and had started to adopt this false sense of identity that the only thing that makes me special is that I've endured being a victim.
mm.
And in some circles, it's called victimology. Um, so I really acquired that kind of addiction, and yet at the same time, there was another part of me that's always been active in me that is is always living with the question, how do I turn the unasked for or even unacceptable into a spiritual gift, into a
Mm,
soul growth gift? And I
mhm.
I call that harvesting. I consider it to be a crucial life skill that is among the crucial life skills that's not taught in school. It's not taught in religious training, and it's not taught in most families for exactly the reason you were saying before, because our parents came by their wounds honestly too. My dad
Yes,
was physically abused growing up. He made a
yes,
vow when I was born. I was the firstborn. And when I was born, he made a vow to himself that he told me about when I was in my 20s.
mm,
And the vow he told me he made to himself was that he was not going to do to his children what his father had done to him. And because he didn't have the benefit of the human potential movement and, things like that, all he could do was make a white knuckle decision. It was a decision about abstinence. He
yeah,
was going to abstain from doing to his children what was done to him. And when he sat me down in my 20s to tell me about that, it was with a huge amount of emotional pain and grief and guilt
mm,
in him. He said to me, I didn't realize until now that I did the same thing to you and your brother that your father did to me, but I only did it in a different form. I shamed you. I did verbal abuse. I didn't do physical
mm,
abuse. I was true to my commitment to not physically abuse you and your brother, but I didn't realize that I just translated it into a different form because I didn't know what else to do.
mm. What do you make of that today, your today version of yourself? What do you make of that? Is it like part of what my mind is going to is almost that there are universal lessons that find us no matter what.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Well, so your question goes to something that is really important to me in terms of the personal purpose world and being purpose driven.
Hmm.
Most Almost everyone in that I'm familiar with in the field of purpose driven life and purpose driven business, they talk only about our what I call our impact mission, the positive impact that we want to have in the world, or
Yep.
we're called to have in the world, which is really, really, really important. But it's only one half of our purpose, because the other half of our purpose is our soul growth mission. And only when we're clear about our soul growth mission and our impact mission and how they synergistically feed off of each other can we really have maximum impact in the world. And I I came in with an awareness that, I don't know how I came in with it, but I did, with
Hmm.
the awareness that my soul growth mission was to finally get in the deepest cells of my being that nothing in the physical universe could either harm me or save me.
Hmm.
And because of how deeply embedded that soul growth mission was, it's what gave me the fuel to turn undesired life experiences into blessings. And I'll share can I share one with you from my teenage years that directly informs the work that I do today?
Yeah, I would love that. Before we get there, can I ask one question? Because
Sure.
in my mind, I hear naysayers or somebody going, well, this sounds like, because I want to be clear how this is different from spiritual bypassing, because you hear a lot about spiritual bypassing these days, right?
Oh, yeah.
Will you distinguish those for us? And
Yes.
okay.
Yes, I will. In fact, I was one of the forerunners back in the late 80s and early 90s who was talking about spiritual bypass before the term was invented. I
Right.
called it New Age denial. That's what I
Yes.
called it back then. And
Yes.
I wasn't demeaning New Age thinking, because I think there's a lot of value in positive thought.
Mm.
But what I was speaking about in my keynotes back then on this topic was how people were using positive thinking as a hiding strategy for avoiding healing their trauma, avoiding
Mm.
healing their wounds. They weren't, what they weren't learning in the new thought world was that, and here's a soundbite of mine from back then, we live our lives at the level of our wounds, not our wishes,
Yeah.
until we heal that stuff. And then it starts to shift. And it translates into a lot of the problems that we see in politics and in business, and in the structure of societies and humanity today. Leaders lead at the level of their self-development limitations despite their highest intentions.
Yes. There was another gentleman in my life who I remember saying the phrase something about, we do the best with the resources that we have. And he said, no, we do the best with the wounding that we have. Again, speaking to the fact that inherent in the human experience is limitation based on our wounding until we address that wounding.
Precisely. Precisely. We can't willpower our way out of unresolved trauma,
Yes. Yes. Will
because,
you
and
say
my,
that again for the kids in back?
sure, we can't willpower our way out of unresolved trauma,
Mm.
because trauma is not embedded in the mind. If it was
Mhm.
only embedded in the mind, we probably could willpower our way out of it. But trauma is stored in our body, in our heart, in our spirits, not just in our thoughts. That's why it can't be willpowered out of.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's why it can be so surprising to folks, I think, and I speak from my own experience around this, who are aware, right? Who are intelligent, who are aware, who are compassionate. they think they've quote unquote dealt with something, right? So like like so many people, had an experience in my childhood that I was aware of. And even as a 3-year-old going through that experience, I was aware of at a completely different level than a lot of 3-year-olds would be. And still, what you say, the truth of the fact that trauma lives in our body, you cannot willpower your way through it. And time again, that episode has popped up as a causal factor for all these other things that I've had to address.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. My definition of forgiveness
Mm,
is demonstrating in the present that I'm no longer harmed by the unacceptable that occurred in my past.
yes, exactly.
Right? It's not about
Mm,
pretending like unacceptable things didn't happen.
totally.
And it's not about doing bypass. It's about doing the deep work of trauma healing, because there's no such thing as a trauma that can't be healed from psychologically and
Mm,
spiritually. There is such a thing as physical injuries that people might not fully recover from physically,
yeah.
but there's no such thing as a trauma that can't be fully healed from psychologically and spiritually.
I love that.
And the healing is where we have extracted the soul growth gifts from the unacceptable experience. And once we've truly extracted those gifts,
Mm,
the rest of what the experience was about becomes irrelevant. It loses its emotional charge for us.
yes.
It loses its ability to over control our reactions in the here and now.
Yes. Well, it's so interesting. I think that point around emotional charge, whether it is drawn towards something or repelled away, the conversation, because talking about parenting, right? And I'm a parent. I've had my own experiences where I've shamed my children and then feel a tremendous amount of shame myself,
Mm.
and figuring out, like, how do we parent in the best way possible with the least amount of trauma? And while it's a worthy question, part of what I've had to live into is also accepting the bigger picture that lessons are going to show up for my kids. I'm going to deliver some of those painful lessons unknowingly,
Yes.
right?
And
And
unintentionally. Yeah.
unintentionally, and that is just part of the journey, and that there's no way for me to not do that in some capacity for them.
It is part of the fabric of our soul growth as human beings.
Yes. Yes.
And that's why the mistakes my parents made, they're I call them loving mistakes,
Yeah.
meaning loving intention, mistaken expression. A loving mistake. I don't harbor resentment toward my parents for that anymore. And to even say it that way understates it, because I harbor gratitude
Yes.
for the gifts that I was able to harvest from those experiences. And that then, maybe, if it's okay, ties us back, brings us back to the experience I wanted to share from when I was a teenager.
Yes, please do.
That has to do with my purpose in life. The seeds for this experience were actually sown when I was about 6 or 7 years old, when I grew up in and around New York City. And at that young age, my parents took me to the United Nations for a tour of the United Nations. Now, of course, you know, there are plenty of people who talk today about the corrupt politics in the United Nations. I would know nothing about that at 6 or 7.
Right.
All I knew at that age was that here was this organization that was supposed to be all about helping the planet function in a good
Mm,
way,
mm.
interconnectedly. And from that visit forward, there were 2 flags that flew in my bedroom: the United Nations flag and the American flag. And in my mind as a child, I was a citizen of the world first, and inside that, I was a proud American, not
Yes.
the other way around. So that that was the foundation. Fast forward to age 16. The war in Vietnam was raging. Now we're looking at when I was in the late 1960s. And my high school was polarized the way that society was, and a lot of high schools were. And the polarization in my high school was two groups. One group was called the hippies, and they wore black armbands to protest the war in Vietnam. And
Yep.
the other group was called the greasers, and they wore white armbands to protest the protesters.
Yes.
And I finally got fed up with this. And I thought, I have to figure out a way to make a statement, because both of these groups are nuts. They're making war against each other, and that's not going to ever create solutions. So I
Mm-mm.
came up at 16 with what I thought was a brilliant idea to bring them together. And I recruited my mom to help me because it required sewing, and I didn't know how to sew, and she did. And what I asked her to create for me was an armband that was actually two bands sewn together, a black armband and a white armband sewn to each other, and across both was the phrase anti-polarization.
Mm.
And so she finishes the armband, and I put it on, and I proudly wear it to school the first day that I have this armband available to me, wanting to bring these two groups together with this protest against what I viewed as craziness. And
Yep.
sure enough, within moments of arriving at my high school, I'm surrounded by a group of hippies and a group of greasers, and they're all yelling the exact same thing to me. You're a coward. You refuse to take a stand. Get off it. Stop being a coward. And I realized I'm standing there listening to this, and I'm saying to myself, oh my God, I got my wish.
You've
I
united
got them
them.
on the same page, but I was the sacrificial lamb. And in that moment, I made a vow that I was going to figure out how to bring people with divergent perspectives together without me being crucified in the process.
Mm,
I was a
mm,
16-year-old commitment.
yeah.
It's what I
Amazing.
have done for my career ever since.
Wow. Well, I was going to say that's a very early experience that relates so poignantly to what you are doing now. In looking back, first of all, I have so many questions. My mind immediate was like, what number are you on the Enneagram? What
I'm
number
an
are you?
Enneagram 1.
I knew it. I'm a 1.
Ah, and for people who know the Enneagram, I will say my favorite joke about being a 1, I'm actually a 17, because 1s evolve towards 7.
7 when they're living in their highest self, right? And
And
the 7 is
yeah,
the lighthearted, fun, being in the moment. Yes.
yes. And I happen to be married to a 7, so I'm constantly inspired towards 7. The 1s are the perfectionists and the idealists
The
for our
idealist.
viewers.
Well,
Yeah.
and often they're the ones willing to take bullets based on principle, right? Based
Yes.
on taking a stand and saying something that is uncomfortable but needs to be said.
Yes.
Are you a 2 wing or a 9 wing? Right? Because the 9
Depends
is the
on the day.
peacemaker,
I
2,
know.
yes, 2 is
As
the
a
helper.
psychotherapist, I was the 2 wing. I was the helper.
Yep.
And as a social change agent, I'm a 9 wing. I'm a peacemaker.
Yeah, exactly. You've got both of those. So fascinating. I love this. So you spot this about yourself, and I love that you made the commitment to figure out how to do this in a way that does not make you the sacrificial lamb.
Yes.
Right? So jump us forward in how this has evolved. And I know there's a lot that has happened between then and now, but maybe you could share a couple of like poignant experiences or turning points in your career that have led you to what you're doing now.
Yeah, I'll share 3. Um, One goes back to that same point in time,
Mm.
1969. My parents sent me to Woodstock, which is a funny thing in and of itself. And maybe I'll tell the full story some other time. But the short version was
I
that I
love
was
your parents. Yeah.
well, My parents had a really strong reaction when they figured out what they had sent me to. I was very involved in performing arts growing up, in acting and in music and all of that. And my parents somehow managed to pull together enough money to send me off to a camp for the performing arts during the summertime so I could keep progressing with all of what I was doing in the way of performing. Well, the spring of 69, the camp director sends a note home to the parents saying, for the first time in the camp's history, we're going to have an optional field trip to music and arts fair in upstate New York. Do you want to send your kid?
Of course.
Now, no one knew what the Woodstock, the 1969 Woodstock, was going to be beforehand. So my parents naively look at me and they say, well, what do you think? What am I going to say? No, I'm not interested. So I thought I went to Woodstock for the music. And believe me, most of the music was over the moon. Really
Yeah.
amazing.
Yeah.
But what I couldn't have known that I went to Woodstock for beforehand was to really see, to experience what it was like to be in a temporary city of 500,000 people who were all joined together to show the world that 500,000 people could have each other's backs and not have crime,
Mm.
even if only for 3 days. And we did that. And that showed me that the lyrics that appeared in music for the first time in the history of music during the 1960s that were telling us we had the power to change the world were actually so. And so that sparked in me a commitment that I was going to discover what my part was in helping to create a better world.
Mm.
Fast forward to September 11th, 2001. I was back in New York where I grew up when 9/11 happened. And I was deeply impacted by being there because I knew people who would have died in the World Trade Center had they not been working out of town on business that day. One of my cousins was that. I
Mm.
grew up with a classmate who lived 4 or 5 doors down from me, who grew up to become a New York City fireman and died rescuing people in the rubble. Or actually before the towers fell, he was racing up the stairs to try to rescue people. And so I was living in the midst of individual and collective trauma in New York, and something broke in me. And what I heard inside myself was, David, you've been playing too small. Now, at that point, I had already established a really excellent reputation as a psychologist, as a psychotherapist, as an organizational development psychologist, et cetera, et cetera. It wasn't like I was having no impact.
Right.
So when I heard inside myself, you're playing too small, I thought, oh my God, well, what does playing
What is
bigger
next?
look like?
Yeah. Yeah.
And what started coming through me was this document called a Declaration of Global Responsibility, which was 10 principles for dealing in a holistic way with the roots of terrorism, which I call fanaticism disorder.
Mm-hmm.
And when that finished coming through me, I made a commitment that I had no idea how it would ever come about, which was that I was going to be brought to Geneva, which is the working capital of the world community, the United Nations and the World Trade Organization, et cetera, et cetera. I was going to be brought over to Geneva to train a group of ambassadors in evolved approaches, collaborative approaches to decision making and policy creation and negotiation. Had no idea how that would happen. 2 years later, I was brought to Geneva to train a group of ambassadors to the World Trade Organization in collaboration-based negotiation tactics, which they didn't even know existed, let alone how to do. All
Right.
they knew was coercion and compromise, both of which are massively inferior problem-solving and negotiation tactics.
Mm.
And that experience solidified for me how I was called to make a bigger difference, that I had been playing too small. And that's what led to my ultimately developing the Center for Enlightened Self-Sovereignty.
Mm, love that so much. I remember when we first met, you talking about this mission. And I think at the time you had maybe a US based project of wanting to take something to Congress, but it was along these exact same lines. And my, oh my, look what's happened, between even that time that you and I have met and now when we're talking about, polarization and, the Trump years, COVID, what's happened to our news, what's happened to the ability of people to go online and remain rational. It's such a big, and I think for so many people, it feels like such a heavy conversation of like, where do we even begin? So, where do we even begin?
We begin by remembering some very, very, very simple, basic, common sense things that seem to have been forgotten.
See, I love the practical side of you. It's coming out right now.
Exactly. The first of those is about our basic architecture as human beings. We are
Mhm.
social beings endowed with free will. Well, what does that translate to in constitutional law? Personal freedom and the common good,
Mhm.
right? So when we have political polarization that looks on the surface like two parties, political parties at war against each other, that's at the symptom level. Below the symptom level, what we've got is a war between two equally and oppositely insane perspectives. One perspective says personal freedom is far more important than the common good. The other perspective says the common good is far more important than personal freedom. They're both nuts.
Yep.
Because the audacious experiment that the United States was the beacon for, and all free societies, or societies that aspire to be free, are attempting to emulate, is to create a society that functions at the intersection of preserving
Mhm.
personal freedom, which I call self sovereignty, and promoting the common good, which I call societal well being. Well, this is our basic fabric as human beings. We are both. We're not one more important than the other. So that's the first common sense piece.
Mhm.
Okay to move on to the second, or did you want to say anything
Yes.
about that?
Nope. I love it. Well, my natural next question is how do we balance these things, right? How do we make choices that honor the two sides?
Mhm. Right. Well, the starting place for that is recognizing that we are both of those things, because until, you know, in fairy tales they have this mechanism called spells, where some evil person casts a spell on someone. Well, the fairy tales are metaphors for our psychological inner workings.
Mm,
And in order for a human being, a real human being, not a human being in a fairy tale, to wake up from a spell, three things have to happen. The first is you have to recognize you've been under one.
yep.
The second is you have to learn how to understand the anatomy of it, the dynamics of it, well enough to spot it when it's being perpetrated.
Mm,
And the third is that you have to have an alternative to the spell that is far more compelling than the spell could ever be. And that
yes.
it's only with those three ingredients working together with each other that we can elevate into an enlightened perspective about something. So the starting place is recognizing we've been under a spell, that the spell is you've got to choose between personal freedom and the
Right.
common good. No, no,
Either
no.
or.
Right.
Yes.
That kind of either or thinking is a form of psychological and spiritual immaturity.
Mm. And where are we, would you say, in all of your observations of trends? Like, where are we in regards to that first step across society?
In the keynotes that I've given around the country and outside the United
Mm,
States too, over the past 20 odd years, what I've noticed, and not just the keynotes, but also media interviews that I've
mm,
given on shows across the political spectrum, is that there is a new silent majority. And this silent majority is thirsty for an end to the divisiveness, but they don't see how to
Yes.
end it.
They don't know
And
the
so they
how.
end up aligning with people that they believe are ones who are going to upset the apple cart. They're going to be the overthrowers of the money changers, if you use a New
Hmm.
Testament story, for example. And so they, in the absence of a holistic, integrative, psycho-spiritually mature vision, kind of like
Hmm.
a 21st century version of the I Have a Dream speech that Martin Luther King gave in the 60s around desegregation and civil rights, until we have the equivalent of a 21st century I Have a Dream speech for reuniting humanity and elevating individuals and societies into functioning uh, through as conduits of higher love and wisdom in the physical universe. Until we
Hmm.
have that version of I Have a Dream, people are going to continue to be drawn to false saviors
Yeah.
who, every single one of them, no matter where they are on the ideological or political spectrum, they have identified a bad guy, an enemy.
Hmm.
Only the enemies are different depending on who you're listening to.
Right.
And the message is always, if we eradicated them, if we got rid of them, we'd be fine. That is sick thinking. That
Hmm.
is thinking that leads to the wars that we have. It doesn't solve them. But my experience is that the new silent majority is thirsty for an alternative to societal divisiveness and political polarization. They're just waiting for one to appear that they resonate with. And that vision starts with understanding this first building block I was just describing around us being social beings endowed with free will,
Hmm.
and about us being able to exercise free will either as egos who think we're separate from and entitled and separated from something larger than us and
Hmm.
entitled to operate um, in our own narcissistic self-interest, no matter what the harm is that we do to others,
Hmm.
versus being conduits of higher love and wisdom in the physical universe. So that's one of the hidden wars going on today as well. There are groups of people who have, throughout history, decided that they know better than everyday human beings what the future of humanity should be, or back in earlier times, not the future of humanity but the future of their locality, their feudal system, their
Yep.
monarchy, whatever they were having
Whatever
control.
they're possessing and wanting to control.
But today, because of how entwined the world is and how instantaneous communication is, these same people from this same mindset are now looking at how can they decide the future for all of humanity.
Yeah.
And that is really a problem because they're operating from ego. They're operating from self-serving special interests, not from that integration of self-sovereignty and societal well-being.
Mm.
So that's another building block, is which version of free will are you going to sign on to? An ego-based version or a version that's based in higher love and wisdom that unites us all?
Yeah. When people, so like one of the things that comes to mind immediately is somebody going, okay, I understand this, it's all well and fine, but what can I do, right? What can I, as this single little speck in the universe, what can I do to make an impact in the right direction, right?
Perfect question, and a spot on question. It's the most important question. And I'll answer it in a moment, but
Mm.
before I do, unfortunately, a lot of people, when they ask that question, they've already answered it for themselves with a
Mm.
false answer,
Like I
which is
can't do
nothing.
anything. Yeah.
Right,
Yeah. Yep.
right. we all know that the problems that humanity is facing today cannot be solved by one person.
Mm.
They're far too big and far too complex for that to happen. However, if each one of us is clear about what our unique personal impact mission is in our chosen spheres of influence, if each of us is doing our part,
Mm.
collectively, all bases that need to be covered will be covered.
Yes.
So if we think that unless we can change the world, we have no impact, that's delusional thinking.
Yep.
You're a mom. You are having massive impact on your children. You're an attorney. You are having massive impact on your clients. You're a thought leader and a trainer around legal aspects of business development. You're having huge impact on ethical business practices. Well, you're doing those things in spheres of influence that aren't my spheres of influence. Thank goodness, because if all of us were doing the same thing, then what needs to get done can't get done.
Right. Well,
Each of us has to do our own part.
it's so, I mean, and it's so important that we arrive to this. I mean, it's one of the things like the conversation you and I were having right before we went live today about how to stay centered in light of being bombarded regularly with negativity and world news and things that truthfully our biological systems are not designed for, right? This incessant flow of traumatic events and information. And so much of my experience in the recent super intense years is looking at all of these scenarios and having to arrive to the point of releasing myself from obligation in relation to all of it, right? And saying, I can't solve all of it. I maybe can't solve that problem, but I can solve this problem in front of me, right? I can do this thing in front of me. I can have this influence in front of me and with the people that I serve and people that I meet. And
I think
uh,
that's an important part of the picture. I think the other
yeah,
part of the picture in terms of staying centered
yeah,
is to adopt a different perspective about what's going on at this point in the evolution of humanity.
yeah,
The species Homo sapiens that we've been for a very, very, very long time is over.
yeah,
A new species is emerging. Well, when we're evolving into a new species, there's no way for that to happen without huge amounts of turmoil. There's an old saying that, and I've never been able to find attribution for, that says mostly people change not because they see the light, but because they feel the heat.
mm,
And that's not just individuals. Mostly societies change, not because they see the light, but because they feel the heat. Every time we deteriorate a little bit more as a society or as a species, part of me pains over that. Part of me grieves over that.
mm,
The bigger part of me rejoices over that. Not because I want the suffering to happen, but
mhm.
because the law of wake up calls for individuals and groups is that when a wake up call to emerge into elevated consciousness is issued and ignored, the universe, in its benevolent, infinite patience, simply reissues the wake up call at a future time at a next higher level of intensity. And the universe will continue to do that until the level of intensity is high enough so that the snooze button on the wake up call alarm clock stops being pushed.
What's fascinating to me about this conversation is I feel like we are back full circle, but almost in a collective way at the no ouch conversation.
Exactly.
Boundaries. Who are we going to be in the future? And
Right.
we are all feeling the heat, and we're feeling it collectively. I think many of us have had even turmoil in personal relationships in new ways that are having us
Yes.
ask new questions and set new boundaries and have new, healthier ways of functioning into the future.
Exactly. We're at no and ouch,
Yes.
but not enough people are yet at yes and yum. They don't know what instead of the no or the ouch. So they
Yes.
go into rebellion, or they
Mm,
go into violence, or they go into being an ostrich sticking their head in the sand, or they go into
yeah.
regressionism, longing for a romanticized version of the good old days that are never going to be coming back anyway.
And that were never truly the good old
Of
days.
course not.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
romanticized. It's
Yeah.
revisionist history.
Yeah. Yeah.
So until we have a clear sense of yes and yum, the no and ouch is not enough by itself. It's
Mhm.
got to have the yes and yum accompanying it, which is why I wrote reimagining humanity.
Well, I was going to say, you have an answer to the yes and yum. And given our time, and I know we could keep talking for hours and hours, and maybe there's a part two of this conversation where we only talk about the yes and yum, but I do think it's really important what we've talked about so far, because I think so many people feel this so deeply, exactly what you've said, and you've put a shape to it and words to it that we can relate to and we can see clearly.
Thank you. That's part of my mission.
Yeah. Yeah. So, folks, if you're listening, I want us to all get to the yes and yum. And I know that David has so many great resources. One being the Center for Sovereign Enlightenment,
And the
Enlightened
Center
Self
for Enlightened Self-Sovereignty.
I got it backwards. Enlightened Self-Sovereignty, which we will definitely share links to. We will also share a link to the previous primer on anger, right? So make sure that you pop over for that. And then finally, what was the last one that you just mentioned, David?
Re,
Reimagining
reimagining humanity.
humanity. Yes. So you can find all of those resources over at the show notes page, which can be found at legalwebsitewarrior.com/podcast. Look for David's episode. David, you are a wealth of love. You are a wealth of knowledge. You are a wealth of wisdom, because wisdom really takes knowledge so much farther. I am so excited for people who have not been exposed to your work to be able to hop over and check out your resources, look at what you've created. Do you like for people to connect with you online? And if so, where would you like to point them?
Sure. Well, I'm on all of the major social networks
Mm.
except for TikTok. I'm not. I've got some problems with
Yeah,
TikTok.
I'm not there either.
But my hub website, my main website is drgruder.com, drgruder.com. And you can, from that site, you can get to all of my different hats that I wear and resources. And you can also be in touch with me through that site.
Perfect. I love that. So we will share that as the primary way, along with the other links that you've just mentioned. David, I so appreciate you. I'm so grateful to know you. And I know, even though, we've probably been on each other's peripheries since meeting, I'm so glad to know that you're in the world. I just really, really deeply appreciate you. What
The
final thoughts?
feelings are so mutual, Heather.
Thank you. And I know we've covered a lot. This has been a big conversation, but if there's a final thought that you would like to leave our listeners with, what is it?
It's all going to be okay.
Mm,
Do your part. Discover what your part is. Do that. Align your personal impact mission with your soul growth mission. Do that. It's all going to be okay. And the last thing I'll say is something that was said to me when I was about 20 years old that pissed me off at the time, and I like it now, though. It's all much too serious to be serious about.
right? Right? I feel that. I still feel that, right? I'm still working my way into the more joyful side of life, but I want us all to be there.
Yeah.
Yeah. I appreciate you, David. I so look forward to being in touch, and we will definitely have a part two or maybe a part three. Who knows? You will be back.
It'll be my pleasure to return.
Awesome. Thank you.
Mhm.